very special evening, we are finally able to come together to celebrate Frank's life. In case some of you are wondering who Zoe and I are and what our relationship is to Frank, we'd like to share that with you. We are not actually Frank's nieces, although that is always how we introduce ourselves. Frank and Shirley were friends with our parents, Earl and Jean Corbett, before either of them married. Our parents valued close friends as an extension of family. Frank and Shirley were our chosen family. Zoe and I and our brothers, Randall and Brent, felt like we had two sets of parents growing up. Every celebration, every struggle, and all of the ordinary life in between was shared with Frank and Shirley. Frank taught us just how big our world could be and always kept us laughing. He was an ideal father figure, giving us unconditional love and guidance without the discipline. Frank's impact on our lives and our children's lives was profound. He blessed our lives beyond measure. Our love and admiration for him runs deep, and every moment we spent with him, we treasure. There isn't a day that goes by that we don't think of him and miss him. But as much as we miss him, thoughts of him always make us smile, and our memories of time with him continue to bring us happiness. To be here with all of you, a room full of people who loved Frank, is pure joy. We are excited to hear from a wonderful lineup of speakers. Jim, Frank's brother, two close personal friends of Frank, Christine Miller and Scott Miller, three close professional friends of Frank, Scott Morrison, Dan Proudfoot, and John Iaboni. We want to extend our gratitude to each of the speakers for traveling here tonight to share their stories with us. And a very special thank you to John Iaboni for all of his guidance in organizing this evening. We also want to thank Joanne and Doug Noble for creating the fabulous bookmarks we have for you to take home tonight. They will be available in the front reception area. Let's now start the celebration of Frank's life. With the person who has known him the longest and who traveled all the way from Alberta to be here tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Moore.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to have there because that works. Okay, can everybody hear me? How about that? Okay. I saw the mic up here. I thought I was going to have to sing a little aria or something, but I won't do that. Well, I'm really pleased to be here tonight. When you get to be my age, you're pleased to be any place, so. And I'd like to thank the ladies for arranging this evening, and I'm sure they put a lot of work into it, so thank you very much, gals. And I would also like to thank my niece and nephew, John and Jennifer Contini, for hosting me out here. It's very gracious of them. Not only is it a bed and breakfast, it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and airport transportation. So I might just stay a couple of weeks. Anyways, one of the great things about visiting with John and Jennifer are their two children, Nicholas, and now Nicholas's fiancée, Amber Lee, and Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is just a great person. All of the Contini family were just at Darnell Nurse's wedding. And I have a great picture here of Elizabeth with Connor and David, Leon Drysettle, and the groom himself, Darnell Nurse. Darnell had the good common sense to marry into the Contini family. He married John's niece. And It's really great. Just a second here. Yeah, and you might think there are 3 stars in this picture. There are really 4 stars. And Elizabeth is the first star. And Elizabeth's Uncle Frank, who chose the 3 stars on many occasions, would always choose Elizabeth as the first star, I'm sure. And it's really great to see Elizabeth again as well. Now, Frank and I were the youngest of 7 children. And I'm certainly taking some liberties when I mention the word youngest. But Frank was about 2 years and a few months older than me. I was the youngest in the family. And we had 4 brothers and 3 sisters. And everybody pretty well went to meet their maker in the order of their age. And when that happens, there's certainly some advantages to being the youngest. Anyways, I'm told that when Frank first set eyes on me, he said, "That's Jimmy." And I'm just glad he didn't say, "That's my name, Jim." I'm just glad he didn't say that's Stinky or something like that. But anyways, Frank and I grew up on a farm 2.5 miles south of Hillsburg, and our dad was not an overly progressive farmer. He actually farmed with horses, which is it's a tough way to farm. But nonetheless, we attended public school in Hillsburg, high school in Erin, and we used to walk 2.5 miles to school. And in the summer, Frank would put me in the crossbar of his bike and give me a ride to school. In the winter, we went out. In those days, anybody that stopped to give you a ride, you jump in the car with them. You weren't concerned about anything else. So we lived on a paved road, so we often got rides to school. And let's see where I'm at here. Yeah, well, there were 4 boys and 3 girls in the family. And naturally, when we were growing up, we really wanted material things. But there was just not a whole lot of money in the household. But we were very fortunate when we were growing up in that some of the older brothers and sisters were out working, and they were always very, very generous to us at Christmas. They always brought us really great presents. I remember one year we got a Daisy air rifle, a BB gun, and man, we cherished that thing. And then another year, we got a box hockey game, which we must have played 1 million games on, with Frank broadcasting them at the top of his lungs, of course. He had a whole league set up and so on and so forth. And when we were growing up, one of our older sisters got married to a chap who was very kind to us. He was a sports fan, so he took us to all kinds of lacrosse games and hockey games, and we used to sort of follow the fortunes. Our brother George, he got moved to a bank in Sundridge, Ontario, and he became secretary of quite a well-known hockey team, the Sundridge Beavers. So we always went to their games when they were in the area, and that's up in Proudfoot's territory. And Jim and Dan Proudfoot lived in the South River. So we were very fortunate. Frank would always return from these little excursions to sporting events and write a story on them. And that was, I guess, his first taste of becoming a sports writer. Let's see here. Now, when we were living on the farm, we had to work very hard on the farm, and for a long time we didn't have hydro, so we were milking. We had a herd of Jersey cattle, and we were milking them by hand, as many as 35 at a time. And I don't know if there's anybody here that's ever milked a cow by hand, but I'll tell you, milking a cow on a hot summer night by hand is cruel and unusual punishment. You got you're there working away at it, you're smart on me, and the cow's hitting you in the face with its tail, peeing on you, and doing some other things on you too, and then maybe giving you a kick for good measure. So Frank became quite adept at that, and he always said when he got to be a sports writer, pulling on a jersey took on a whole new connotation for him. He'd be quite amused by the fact that the Leafs have milk on their sweater now. So that was something. And we didn't have hydro on the farm for a long time, so Frank used to listen to Hockey Night in Canada, Foster and Bill Hewitt, unless a mouse chewed the wires or the battery went dead on our radio. Little did he know at the time that he was going to be traveling around with Foster and Bill Hewitt in later years. He always said Bill Hewitt was a bit of a pain in the bum, but nonetheless, he was friends with those guys. And yeah, we were chugging away there on the farm, and we got the hydro in. So our dad went to Canadian Tire store and bought a 2-unit milking machine because we had the power to run it. And Frank quickly caught on to running that, so he used to do all the milking himself. And that was sure a break because I was just getting to the age where I was going to have to start milking the cows by hand. Not a lot of fun, but it did provide a living for us on the farm. Another thing we did on the farm, we grew turnips. Now, if there's anybody here that doesn't like eating turnip, they can leave right now. No. But we grew turnips, and Frank and I particularly, the turnips were very labor-intensive to grow and harvest, and we always looked forward to that because we got the money from all the turnips we could sell in Hillsburg. So we would go door to door with selling turnips by the bushel, 50 cents a bushel. And I see you got to go up to turnip now, $3 or something like that, eh? So we would sometimes split $100 out of our turnip sales. And Frank, of course, would go and buy Photoplay and Esquire magazine, and Hockey News, and Sports Illustrated, Spark magazine. I was a little more prudent. I put the money away. I'd usually end up giving it to Frank so he could buy more magazines. Anyways, that was that. And I think back to some of our exploits together. One thing we did, and hopefully the statute of limitations is run out on it, we had a little gravel pit in the farm. And when the construction company moved in to use it, we would drop by to see them and steal cigarettes on them. And Frank always got sick when he smoked back then, but I never did. I never smoked after that at all. Frank did for a number of years. But we grew up without a whole lot. We wanted a pool table in a bad way. So Frank solved that by cutting pockets into the dining room table. And it became a little inconvenient when Frank was trying to make the 8-ball in the side pocket and the rest of the family were trying to have supper. But anyways, we persevered. I often get asked if, being a sports writer, Frank was much of an athlete himself. And he wanted to be, but he just wasn't. He became the substitute goalie on a junior D team. Here, the Huron Legion sponsored a junior D team one year, and Frank was the second goalie. And I think he played a couple of games. Not too many players drafted out of junior D. And he also, Hillsburg was one of the first small communities that had a floodlit ballpark. So we had a pretty good softball team, and we used to get up to like 1,500, 2,000 people at the ball games. And Frank was the catcher. He was a good catcher, but he couldn't hit and run. And Frank was telling me one time that he asked Scotty Bowman about his goalies on the Detroit Red Wings. And Scotty said, I got two goalies. One is Osgood, and the other's no good. And I think that's where Frank fit into that. And Frank we played golf quite a bit in years, and before Frank went with the Star, but he never played a whole lot after. I still play golf all summer, so it's sort of strange that he never kept on at that. Now, we were sort of sailing along on the farm, and our dad was having trouble swallowing, and he went to the doctor and was diagnosed with throat cancer. And he was 55 years of age. And back then, this is a long time ago, there wasn't chemo and all the various treatments you can have for cancer. And they pretty well said, you go home and, your days are numbered. So there we were in our mid-teens, trying to run the farm, trying to go to high school, and seeing our dad lose strength day to day. As Queen Elizabeth would say, that was our annus horribilis. It was a hell of a career. And our dad did die after about 9 months. And we sold the farm. My mom sold the farm for $12,500 and bought a house in Guelph, Ontario. And it had a little apartment in it, so she could have some income. Now Frank was trying to complete grade 13, saw an ad in the paper for a radio station in Chatham, Ontario. So he applied for the ad and he got the job. And then he stayed at that for a little while. Mom and I were still on the farm, and he went to a radio station in Sault Ste. Marie. And I think they were pretty well told Frank that his future wasn't in radio. And he sort of come home to Guelph, was tail between his legs, and was living with Mom and I in the house he'd purchased in Guelph. And he was actually got a job. He was weighing trucks at Guelph Sand and Gravel, and hardly a career position. And he spotted an ad for the newspaper in Cornwall. They were looking for a sports editor. And he applied, and the manager met him in Toronto and said, well, we'll give you a shot at it. And he went down to Cornwall. The newspaper was called the Cornwall Daily Standard Freeholder. And Frank went there and he immediately started to produce a column a day, every day. And you guys and people that have been involved in sports writing know that's no easy task. But he promoted local sports, and they eventually said, hey, Frank, you're doing great. You can stay in the job. And he was naturally relieved at that. But Frank always felt guilty about leaving Mom and I alone. So he came back to the Guelph Daily Mercury as a and he's very good at that as well. But then the sports editor of the Mercury, a guy by the name of Hugh Bowman, who also did play-by-play, he left the Mercury and went with the radio station. I think he was doing the play-by-play for the Kitchener Rangers or the old Guelph Rangers or whoever. So Frank naturally got the job as sports editor. And he was doing that for quite a while, writing a column a day. And he really promoted local sports. Even though Frank covered hockey and a lot of sports, really, his favorite sport was softball or fastball, which is a fading sport now. There's not a lot of it around because he played the game and so on. And so he really promoted the local teams. He improved attendance at their sport. And of course, he covered the Junior A hockey team. And Guelph, which back in those days had Gilbert and Raquel and a lot of very good players. So that was, and they really did a great job at that. Now, there's a couple of things I'd overlook. One of the features, or the highlights of our summer living on the farm, was getting to the Canadian National Exhibition. And Frank and I would collect pop bottles year-round, cash them in before we went to the X. And that was, back in those days, they used to give you a ticket. When you left school in June, they give you a ticket to the CNE grounds, and a ticket to the afternoon grandstand. So we would catch the bus in Erin, first thing in the morning, and go to the X and stay right till after the fireworks. And our mom, she was really an influence in our lives. She was a school teacher, and she read to us far beyond the age where we should have been being read to. But she developed a love of reading in both of us, and certainly of writing and reading and stuff like that with Frank. And we must have read the Hardy Boy books numerous times. And Frank was quite thrilled when he found out that Franklin W. Dixon, who wrote those books, was actually Brian McFarland's father. And he always just loved Brian McFarland because of that. But, and our mom could always find the money. There wasn't a lot of money around the house. That's one thing Frank and I talked about over the years, you know. We saw our dad, he worked so bloody hard and really didn't make a lot of money. Frank and I always had good jobs and made a few bucks, and so did Frank. It just made us sad to talk about that. What we often did, about how hard Dad worked and died at a relatively young age, and that we, you think you're working hard, but I tell you, being a sports writer, there's nothing like milking a Jersey on a hot summer night. Anyways, we used to get very sad just talking about that back and forth. And Mom was always able to scrape up some money for us to see things. We probably saw the King of the Sport Court, four-man softball team, 5 times. And also, when we go to the X, we'd always go to Beach's Fastball League, always had a tournament going on at the X, and we would see those games that had some of the best fastball players in Canada playing. And I remember once, we're at that, and Joe Louis was there. He had a fastball team in Detroit called the Joe Louis Punchers. And he was there with the fastball team. Of course, I was sort of awestruck at seeing this great celebrity boxer Frank went over, of course, and started talking to him. And Joe was quite kind and talking to him. Also, in going to the exhibition, I think Frank was maybe 16 or 17 at the time, Frank got to see his favorite band. Now, you'll have to go home and Google it, because you probably never heard of them. It was Spike Jones and the City Slickers. Yeah, favorite. There you go. No. Yeah, good for you. And he got Mom saw that she knew he loved that band. She saw that he got to see them, which was a big thrill for him. So, anyways, Frank was chugging away at the sports editor of the Mercury, doing a very good job. He was well respected in the community. And if Frank didn't know the various technical stuff about the sport, he'd always seem to be able to write it from the human aspect. And I think that showed in a lot of the stuff he did. But we were having lunch with our mom one day, because the board was cheap and the food was pretty good, and the phone rang. And lo and behold, it was Milt Donnell, phoning to see if Frank was interested in the position with the Toronto Star. And it took Frank about 5 seconds to make up his mind on that. And Milt Donnell was a person that Frank just had undying respect for. And I think probably everybody in that particular profession had a lot of respect for Mr. Donnell. And Frank just loved him. And so he went with the Star. He started out doing the junior hockey and various other things. And then he sort of moved, he never looked back from that time. I know at the time of Frank's passing, there were so many nice comments. I was just overwhelmed with them. And so many sports writers said about Frank taking them around and introducing them to the various people they should meet. And but Frank told me, he said, you know, when I started at the Star, Dan Proudfoot's brother, Jim, was there, right? And Jim Proudfoot did that, and also another sports writer who was quite senior at the Star, Red Burnett. Frank always said Red was a bit of a crusty guy, but he was very, very good to see that you met the right people, which I guess in the sports writing game is important. So I think Frank really made up his mind that he was going to pay that forward. And he was apparently very good at introducing new sports writers and that to the various people that he knew. And that sort of gave him, I guess it gave him a bit of a leg up in the reporting game. And then he got the cover of the Leafs, and was quite thrilled with that, the original 6, and so on and so forth. But he also covered, he really liked covering the International Horse Show at the Royal Winter Fair. I liked him covering it too, because he always got me tickets to it. So he covered that, but as well as covering it for the Star, Frank, I guess he sort of sold the services around the world, and he used to make quite a bit of money reporting to the other countries as well. And he was always thrilled with doing them. I don't know if he really knew that much about horse jumping, but nonetheless he was able to write it to everybody's satisfaction. Now, Frank covered figure skating for a number of years. He didn't know much about figure skating, but he got, what he didn't know, he made up for with the human aspect, bringing that into his story. And the one thing that really surprised me was when he started to cover motorsports. Now, Frank didn't know the speedometer from a gear shift on the car. And he, I don't know if any of you ever ridden with Frank, but he was a world's worst driver. The last time I rode with him, we were going along, and I was just busy crossing myself. I'm not Catholic. Anyways, we did get to our destination, but and Frank was just recently inducted into the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame, and so he just only graciously went and accepted the award on Frank's behalf. He would have been thrilled with that, and so he covered motorsports for quite a while. So he had a long and rewarding career. From a personal standpoint, we moved to Camrose, Alberta. Now, if you want to think I live in Canmore, think it, because that's where all the rich people live. But we live in Camrose, which is about an hour from Edmonton. And Frank thought I was crazy moving out there, and he told me that. What the hell are you going there for? But our only child, we always wanted grandchildren. We finally had one. We just wanted to see him grow up. And we quite enjoyed our time out there. But Frank and I always kept in contact. We were just buddies. And we used to talk to each other every day. And it wasn't always easy from Frank's end for him to do that. But he always persevered. And we had great chats, almost on a daily basis, right up to the time he passed away. But I tell you, his passing left a terrible void in my life. And, this was a guy that I grew up with. He was always kind to me, and we even stole cigarettes together. And I can say that because I think the statute of limitations has run out on it. So, but I miss Frank tremendously, and it has left a bit of a gap in my life. But he was a great brother, a great friend, and we just had a wonderful acquaintance. Now, some things, just in closing, before I get the gong here. In closing, I'd like to tell you a few things about Frank you might not know. Frank was a very good dancer. And Frank was always a bit of a ladies' man, and that was the way you got girls back in those days, go to the country dances and get dancing, and who knows. Anyways, Frank and my sister Marion, they actually won some dance contests, so he's a very good dancer. And Frank, money never really mattered that much to him. He wasn't possessed with money, and didn't care about having a big flashy car or anything like that. And he just was happy to do his sports writing, and he had great times with his fellow sports writer. And I suspect we're going to hear about some of those, and I'm looking forward to it in a few minutes. So I want to tell you people, and thank you people from the bottom of my heart for your coming out here tonight. I'm very, very grateful to you all. And it certainly shows. Well, Frank was a great buddy from mine. He was also a great buddy of many of you here. So thanks for coming. Thank you very much.
You didn't look at your papers at all. I don't think I'll be able to follow that. I need my glasses. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Miller. It is my privilege to be here with you this evening as we reflect upon and celebrate the rich and colorful life of our dear friend Frank. To the Miller family, it was Frank and Shirley, always said in the same breath. They were always together and always the same, and they were woven into our lives as family. It all began in 1957 when Frank Orr came courting Shirley Turner. Shirley and my mother Virginia were classmates at St. Joseph's School of Nursing in Guelph. And on this particular evening when Frank came to call, he invited Virginia to come along for hamburgers. And what followed was a friendship that spanned more than 60 years. Frank and Shirley had an important place at our table at our family farm, a place we still call home, and where my mom still likes to chase cattle. Easter and Thanksgiving dinners with our ever-expanding crowd would not have been the same without their presence. They were part of us, part of our story, and present for all things important: christenings, graduations, weddings, and funerals. In time, our parents, Dick and Virginia, had 15 grandchildren, and Frank made a point of knowing what each one was doing, what their plans were, what their story was. He had a genuine interest in people and what made them tick. Even after losing Shirley and selling his home, Frank worked hard to forge new friendships at the retirement home. He was fascinated by the life story of his table mate, who had a PhD in immunology. They shared red wine and talked together, helping off the boredom and loneliness of the pandemic. Even when food was being served on styrofoam plates and dropped outside the door, Frank would call to chat, telling me he'd set a proper place and poured himself a glass of wine, and he was making the most of things. To us, growing up, Frank and Shirley were our window into city life. It was Frank who took us on our first subway ride, which was a thrill to children who had only ridden in a car and on a school bus. I also recall Frank taking us to the top of the Bank of Montreal building so we could look down on the foundation of what would later become the CN Tower. We loved our visits to their beautiful home on Edenvale Crescent. In the summer, Frank would be flipping burgers and telling tales, entertaining us with his one-liners that may raise an eyebrow today, but we thought hilarious each time they were told. Did you guys know I have one hair on my chest and it cracks like a whip when I sneeze? Or another well-told favorite. I was a bedwetter as a kid, and it was so damn cold in my bedroom in the morning they would have to come and chip me out. I have warm memories of their home at Christmas time. I can see Frank spinning the vinyl in the rec room. He and my dad Richard belting up the Statler Brothers, class of '57. Dinners at Christmas were in the formal dining room with the red velvet wallpaper and the white table linens. While Shirley held court, Frank eased the formality of it all, shouting, "Getting kids to sit at this table is like herding cats." He had a great enthusiasm for good food, and he would delight us with his newly discovered recipes. I loved our talks together in the kitchen. While he chopped and sautéed, he teased out what was going on in my life, sharing his wisdom and his insights, as well as his love of cooking. I missed that familiar sight of his black Cadillac, driving slowly up our dusty lane, and Frank emerging with an armload of appetizers he'd made and bottles of wine, and Shirley with flowers from my mom. We knew and loved him as our friend Frank, and our lives were made much richer by knowing him. He will always have a place at our table, and he will remain forever in our hearts. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Scott Miller. Before I begin Okay. Thank you. I'll start over there. Good evening, my name is Scott Miller. Before I begin, on behalf of the Miller family, I want to thank Zoe and Lisa for organizing this celebration tonight. I feel honored to have this opportunity to share some memories of Frank, our dear friend, and man who influenced many people through his presence and his writing. It seems very fitting here tonight to be here at the Hockey Hall of Fame with the Maple Leafs in action just down the street. To my parents, Frank and Shirley were very special friends. I think probably connected by the rural roots. To us kids, they were like extended family. They were, I guess you could say, like foundational pieces, and always been there, and would always be, as you made your way through your life. At any milestone event, Frank and Shirley were always guaranteed to be there. They always made the extra effort to stay connected. And if they were going to be in attendance, didn't want to miss the opportunity to spend time with them. Visiting Edenville Crescent was extra special. It was, for us kids, a trip to the big city. We would spend endless hours in Frank's pool and enjoy Frank's love of cooking on their back patio. We have an 8mm home movie of us doing flips off the diving board, and in the background you can see Frank flipping burgers on his charcoal barbecue. The fact that it's captured on 8mm film tells you how long ago that was. It was during these summer visits that I learned of Frank's ability to deliver a one-liner in a very timely manner. It was always guaranteed to put a smile on your face. The one he would use on us as we made our way to the pool in our swim trunks went like this. He would stop us and he'd say, "Hey you guys, I don't swim in your toilet, so don't pee in my pool." Everybody would laugh, and then you could hear Shirley in the background saying, "Oh Frank, for heaven's sakes." And then she would laugh too. Often, after dinner, we would explore Frank and Shirley's basement. I have memories of walking into Frank's big office and gazing at all of his press passes that were pinned on a big bulletin board. Newspaper clippings, pictures, shelves of books, and his name as the author, and of course, Frank's typewriter. As a young kid, you were kind of in awe of all the places that Frank had been and the people he knew. As many years passed, my siblings and I would find ourselves taking our own kids to Frank and Shirley's for barbecues and Christmas dinners. They always took a special interest in all the kids and always wanted to know all the details. The conversations were never superficial. Now, my brother Steve, who lives in Australia, forwarded me this memory that he wanted me to share tonight. Now, he's a pretty good storyteller, but I'll do my best here. He writes this: Frank and Shirley were a regular fixture in Miller Thanksgiving gatherings in later years. Typically, we'd be wrapped up in activities with the kids at the Rockton Fall Fair during the day, and by the time we got back to the farm in the afternoon, Frank and Shirley were already there, visiting with Mom and Dad over a cocktail. This one year, I was asked to MC the pet show at the fair. Now, this really involves being on stage and introducing each cute kid and their pet to bleachers full of parents and relatives. When I arrived back at the farm and settled in for a chat with Frank and Shirley, Frank asked me how things went. Well, I said I had a bit of an incident to relate. So I relayed the story to Frank, listening intently by the west window, with the sun streaming in and the colors of the trees in the background all ablaze. So I said to him, so after introducing quite a few kids, I was starting to get a little bit tired and evidently a little bit tongue-tied too. This young boy comes up to me with his dog. "Hello, what's your name?" "Billy." "And who do you have with you here today, Billy?" "Oh, this is Spike." "Okay, and what is Spike going to do for us today?" "He's going to sit, shake, and play dead." I then repeat, "Okay, Spike, he's going to shit, shake." And at this point in the story, there wasn't a heartbeat to spare when Frank jumps right in. "Well, you must admit it would have been one hell of a trick if the kid could have pulled it off." You just could not beat Frank with the one-liners, always with perfect timing. But it also shows something else, and that is that Frank was always interested in our stories, what was going on in our lives. Yes, it is true that Frank and Shirley were special friends of the family, but somehow friends doesn't quite cut it. They were part of the family and will always be remembered as such. Thanks to Steve for that memory from Australia. Yes, Frank's ability to deliver the one-liner and precision timing will be one of the great memories that I will take forward with me. He had that gift, knowing just what to say in all kinds of situations, and it always made you smile. There's one time that's special for me. The situation was this. I I was standing at my own father's funeral a little more than 15 years ago. As one would expect, feeling a little bit uneasy. Relatives and friends are standing around expressing their condolences, searching for the right words. And looking back, I can't recall one thing anyone said to me, with the exception of one person, and that person was Frank. He walked up to me, he leaned down and in, like he always did, and delivered a one-liner that I've cherished ever since. And he said to me, "Scott, show me a guy who didn't like Dick Miller, and I'll show you a guy without a hope." It was classic Frank, the perfect one-liner for the moment. And to this day, whenever I reflect back on his words, it does bring a smile to my face. So, Frank, I'm going to steal one from your playbook here, the perfect one-liner for this occasion, and it goes like this. Show me a guy who didn't like Frank Orr, and I'll show you a guy without a hope. He was simply that, a man who was impossible not to like. Thank you.
To be in broadcasting, so I have to get the right mic. I'm greatly relieved that Scott, tremendous speech, Jim, everyone, and you broke the barrier on swearing, so thank Christ for that. So excuse my language, but I'm sure by now, sitting in the press box in the Maple Leaf Heavenly Gardens, once or twice, or maybe, 20 or 30 times, Frank has leaned over to God and said, "Kid, is fuck up hyphenated?" Fuck is indeed a four-letter word. Covering the Maple Leafs for so many years, so many of us had Frank lean over and deliver that line, and the Leafs of the 80s certainly gave him plenty of opportunities to use it. They still do. But no matter how many times we heard it, we laughed, always. Because it was Frank, and Frank made you laugh. I was thinking, and it's been mentioned tonight, it's so fitting that we're gathered here on a Saturday night, a hockey night, and in the Hockey Hall of Fame. And Frank's plaque is right over there. The Leafs are losing 1-0 to Ottawa. Frank, over to you. I'd like to thank Lisa and Zoe for organizing this celebration of Frank's life, and what a life and career it was, and what it turned out tonight, not surprising. When I first met Frank back in the early 80s as a young kid starting my career, I was in awe. Everybody who met Frank as a young kid was in awe. I'd grown up reading him, and he was a legend in my eyes and in everyone's eyes. And then when I got to work alongside him, got to know him, I realized that he truly was a legend in so many ways, as a writer and as a person. He was the dean of hockey writers, not just in Toronto, but around the National Hockey League. He was a must-read. He was the best. When you think of legends in the history of the game, there is Bobby Orr on the ice, and there is Frank Orr in the press box. As Dave Perkins has said, Frank wasn't a fan with a media credential. He knew the game inside out, had the respect of all. He was a great pro. But even with his stature in the business, Frank still was always so welcoming. All the hockey writers in the room tonight would say the same thing. It didn't matter where you were in your hockey career, hockey writing career, Frank always treated you as an equal. Everyone in hockey knew Frank Orr. He was a rock star, even if he loved jazz. When he'd go on the road and he walked into a dressing room, coaches and players and managers and writers all jumped to talk to him. And while he didn't have to, Frank would always make a point of introducing you to all of them. He was so generous with his time and his contacts and his praise and his direction, helping so many young reporters to grow. I learned so much about the game and came to know so many people in the game through Frank. I asked a few of the guys here tonight for a Frank story or a thought about Frank. And it always came back to the same. He was welcoming, inclusive. He was a mentor in the press box and outside it. For a lot of us, he was almost like a second father, because he cared. As Mike Zeisberger and others have said, when Frank came up to you and he said he enjoyed your work, it was better than any award you could ever receive. Away from the rink, he was a wonderful travel companion and taught me and all of us so much, introducing us to great wining and dining, theater, concerts, books, the list goes on. He truly was a mentor in hockey and in life. And that's a word that is often overused and misused, but not in the case of Frank. As Jim O'Leary reminded me, Frank's number one rule on the road was no talking about whatever stories you filed that day. We are competitors at the rink, but friends otherwise. And when we go to a city, we'll enjoy that city. And so we all did. A lot of us are richer for the cultural experiences Frank exposed us to, and a little bit lighter in the wallet as well. A lot of per diems got burned in one night, but it was worth every cent. For me, Frank took me to places I'd never have gone. We saw an Ella Fitzgerald concert. I would never go see Ella Fitzgerald, but we went to an Ella Fitzgerald concert, and I remember sitting there, and she was singing, doing her scat, and she was elderly at the time, and in the middle of the song, her legs gave out. She fell on the stage, fell on her behind, and she never missed a note. It was absolutely brilliant. And Frank leaned over to me and he said, "Pretty good, eh, kid?" I said, "Well, at least we know splat really is a sound." We went to see Stevie Ray Vaughan in concert, two of us. The only ones wearing sport coats and ties, heading out to a 5-star dinner afterwards. Partway through the concert, he leaned over to me and he said, "You realize everyone is looking at us. I think they think we're narcs." And the restaurants. I remember so many years ago, Wolfgang Puck. Now, I didn't know Wolfgang Puck from a hockey puck. I knew T.C. Puck, who was Harold Beller's dog. I didn't know Wolfgang Puck. Anyway, he opened a new restaurant in Beverly Hills called Spago. Well, Frank was so excited about this. And we were doing a road trip to LA. He booked a reservation 6 months ahead of time. So when we got to LA, Frank said, "Kid, I'll take care of the car, the rental car." He got us a Cadillac. He said, "We're not going to Spago in a beater." Anyway, he was so excited. When we got to the restaurant, we pull into the parking lot, the valet comes out, he walks up and he pulls up the car door, and the door is locked. Frank had no idea how to unlock the door on the Cadillac. He hit one button. Jim O'Leary had a similar experience. Frank hit one button, the front hood popped up. He hit another button, the trunk popped up. He hit another button, the seat flipped back. He hit another button, the window opened. The valet reached in, unlocked the door. Frank turned to me and he said, "Kid, we didn't have a lot of valets or Cadillacs in Hillsburg." For a lot of us, life on the road was a perfect storm. On one trip, we'd have Frank, and we would know all about fine dining and eating well and seeing a show or a concert. On the next trip, we'd have Rick Fraser, and know we would be drinking well. We were drinking earlier tonight, but both great travel companions, and always lots of laughs. And Frank, as you all know, had a million lines. I'm going to give you a couple. He'd say about one particular individual, he loves himself so much, he has a clause in his contract that he gets to die in his own arms. I'm just glad I got to cover hockey before Damien invented it. Some are inappropriate, but we'll soldier on. The Leafs were so bad, even the paraplegics walked out. I guess funny at the time. When the bill would come at the end of one of those 5-star classy restaurant dinners, he'd look at it and he'd say to the waiter, "I didn't know I broke a window." And then he'd pick up the tab. A few nights watching those crappy Leafs teams, he'd say, "The Leafs look tighter tonight than a cow's ass in fly season." He said, "I bet on horses smaller than that Lindros kid." When he'd see somebody diving on the ice, he said, "He went down like a drip from a tall cow's ass." Hillsburg farm stories. And then they all, one of the best, we'd be in one of those fancy restaurants, and he'd say, "I wouldn't say this place is owned by the mafia, but the dinner special tonight is broken leg of lamb." He was always cracking lines and had you laughing all the time. No one ever said a bad word about Frank around the entire NHL, except for Hal Ballard, and that was okay, because he was an idiot. Frank would refer to Harold as Millhaven Fats. Minnesota Fats in billiards, Millhaven Fats in jail. And he'd say Ballard with his orange hair, "It has more chemicals in it than Lake Erie." Lance Harvey reminded me of the time at a Leafs family Christmas skating party. Frank was sitting in the stands, and when Ballard came out on the ice dressed as Santa Claus, Frank said to those sitting around him, he said, "Ballard playing Santa is like Hitler playing Jesus Christ." But Harold gave him a hard time. We heard the lines over and over, but it didn't matter because it was Frank, and he always made you feel good and special and good about yourself and your career. He was just a wonderful man, a great talent, a great person. Sometimes your heroes disappoint, but not Frank. Someone once said it's the emptiest and yet the fullest of all human messages. Goodbye. Well, goodbye from all of us in the press box, and thanks. And be sure to let us know what God thinks about fuck up. Is it hyphenated?
Thank you. Well, I was going to wear a suit tonight. I really intended to wear a suit. I want you to know that. I tried on 3 of my suits. None fit. Frank Orr taught me to eat, but he didn't teach me the secrets of portion control. He never got that. But here I am, and I'm charged with talking a little bit about Frank and motor racing. I have to begin by saying we met for the first time on the way to Mosport in September 1963. The reason was I was going to Ryerson at the time, had no car, I had no ride, and I guess Brother Jim set me up with Frank. So, glad to say, there we were, going going to Mosport. Frank at the time was 27 years old. He seemed immensely mature to me. I think he was in his second year of covering car racing. And I was a zealot, I have to say. I'd been to Mosport previous to this while living in South River. I used to drive my 37 Chevy down for the big race in the fall. And the first one in '61, I went with the North Bay Auto Sports Club. We stayed in a huge bell tent. So that's the background. When I say I was a zealot, I thought that car racing was going to be the next big sport. All it needed was better coverage in the newspapers, and people would catch on. That's what I thought. I'd actually met Hal Walker, the sports editor of the Toronto Telegram, just a couple weeks earlier. This was September. I just started at Ryerson, and I guess Jim took me to an Argo practice and met Hal Walker. So I actually lectured him on how lousy the telly's coverage was of car racing. What he thought of that, who knows. I was delivering the telly only a year earlier. But I was also an expert on this idea of car racing getting more attention. Now here's the thing. Frank was very frank with me about covering car racing. He told me that he wasn't that crazy about car racing, but the people were interesting. And that to me was kind of a lukewarm enthusiasm. But anyway, that's the way we started. I don't think I got over Frank's candor for some years because I was so easily hurt on the subject. Car racing meant so much to me. With the years, I've come to recognize that with Frank's emphasis on the personal over the mechanical, he actually was the outstanding racing writer of the time, back 60s into the 70s. He introduced the first Canadian drivers who were ready to challenge European drivers. He made them human. He gave his readers a real acquaintance of these athletes. His quotes made his stories. Horst Kroll, on winning the 1968 Canadian Championship, said in Frank's story, "At least my mechanic got a set of tools. All I got was a busted trophy and a handshake." People could relate to that. Harvey Hudis, the chartered accountant who took over Mosport, I think in '64, on knowing nothing about the sport, Harvey said in Frank's story, "I was a number cruncher who figured a four-wheel drift must involve snow." Billy Foster, on his engine failing while leading the last lap of the stock car race, said, "If it rained soup, I'd have a fork." Now, this was all Frank. To my mind, it was him just picking things people could relate to. He also had a keen eye for angles that readers could identify with. For example, describing Richard Petty sprinting back to the pits from Moss Corner when his Plymouth pooped out, because Petty figured that his battery had died. So Frank described it thusly. Petty picked up he first said Petty sprinted back to the pits. Now that would be one hell of an achievement in itself, given the distance from Moss Corner to the pits, at least a mile of up and down terrain. Petty picked up a fresh battery and a wrench and carried it back to the car for installation and finished the race. That's amazing stuff. And I have to say that I think that if I had been writing that story, given the way I look at motorsports, I would have probably downplayed Petty's superhuman effort and zeroed in on what was it that caused the battery to go flat. Could it have been the alternator? What was it? And ho-hum would be how readers would react to that. Sometimes it was said Frank was too nice in his writing. Now, not always I'd respond to that. In 1970, he wrote a book on George Eaton becoming the first Canadian regular in Formula One. And I wondered at the time whether the book had been commissioned by the Eaton family. By the third page, it was pretty clear that the Eatons were not financing that book. Quote, when he walks, Eaton's legs appear to be made out of rubber, Frank wrote. He was only getting started. At this point, he's bow-legged and his toes point out in opposite directions. Although the game he plays demands a man to be aggressive, forceful, and decisive, when he is not in a racing car, George Eaton frequently appears ill at ease and extremely shy, totally lacking in any push or self-confidence. Instead, he is nervous, almost to the point of being self-conscious. Some hero making here, huh? His hands tremble, especially when he is forced to execute even the simplest of manual maneuvers, giving him impressions of a small, frightened bird that has fallen out of the nest and will flap away at the first confrontation. I found it unbelievable. It was hilarious, and at the same time, it just perhaps accurately described the way George was out of the car. Now, Frank and I were only actually at the track together as reporters in direct competition between 1966 and 1974, when I covered races for the Telegram, UPI Wire Service, and the Globe and Mail. And then later, between 1986 and 1996, when IndyCar racing came to Toronto, and Frank was back on the motorsports beat. One race weekend, he invited me to dinner in Indianapolis, I think, explaining it was his 60th birthday, and he had no intention of spending it alone. We'd had many good times together during my years on the Leaf beat, 69 to 74, along with your next speaker, John Iaboni. But this was 22 years later and marked the resumption of our wonderful conversations. Frank was named to the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame in September of 2021, as his brother noted, but it should have been many years earlier. Perhaps the nominating committee thought that Frank's presence in the Hockey Hall of Fame and the Etobicoke Hall of Fame somehow made him ineligible. I don't know. Didn't figure. But the ultimate awaits when he's named to the Great Sports Quipsters Hall of Fame. And here, I have to admit, my two quips that I prepared to give you were stolen by Scott just a few minutes ago. He beat me to it. Harold Ballard's hair has more chemicals in it than Lake Erie. I don't want to say this restaurant is owned by the mob, but one of the entrees is broken leg of lamb. Frank, thanks so much for all these memories.
Present lines that others don't present. So luckily, Frank had so many lines, but I think we won't disappoint you. But first of all, thank you, Lisa and Zoe. This is a Hall of Fame celebration of life for a truly one-of-a-kind Hall of Fame person. My link to Frank began when my dad made certain we subscribed to the Toronto Daily Star. So in 1961, when I was 10 and hockey mad, anything with Frank's byline was must reading. By the time I first met him in 1968, his coverage of junior hockey and stories in virtually any hockey magazine I devoured made him a celebrity to me. Jim, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but as with you, he was like a big brother to me. Although we don't look alike, you look far more like Frank than I. Despite us being intense newspaper rivals, and we were, he was extremely kind, ensuring he introduced me to anyone he talked to or knew from his vastly superior sports writing experience over me. We traveled together on the junior hockey and NHL beats for 16 years. Then from 1991 to 2015, when I was editor of the Maple Leafs game program, Frank was my go-to guy. He could write about anything or anyone quickly, with such flair and depth that life for me as editor was a breeze. It was clean copy at its best. Aside from all this, we made for a pretty good comedy team. Frank needed a straight man, and I fit that role perfectly. He called my dad the Don. I'm not going to bring in the line about the broken leg of lamb, but you can figure that out. Referring to me, he'd say, "You've heard of Razzo Rizzo and the Italian stallion. Well, here's the Dago donkey." And I don't take any offense to that, and if anybody in the room does, please don't. That was Frank. His one-liners never grew old. Tiger Williams' face is so smooth he can bite a wall. He's so thin if he stuck out his tongue it'd be a zipper. Gilbert Perreault has more moves than a belly dancer. When a game was really bad, as it often was, he'd say, "Flood the hook zone." You can spot so-and-so because he's wearing a gray suit and everyone around him is yawning. Invariably, any game when someone took a puck on or near the private parts, he'd say, "Don't rub them, count them." And of course, you knew exactly who he was talking about when he said, "The Leafs are 2 heart attacks away from the Stanley Cup." Whenever we'd have the German wine Liebfrau milk with the brand name Blue Nun, he'd say, "Let's have a sad sister or two tonight." Our escapades into Italian Reds allowed us to savor the best Nemarones, Chiantis, and Valpolicellas. You see, Frank and I spent far and above our per diems, as has been pointed out by others tonight. Dipping into our personal money was never an issue. In one of our last conversations prior to his passing, we reminisced and agreed that our sports coverage era was likely the last great one. We went from dictating stories, typewriters in Western Union, to early computers, but with limited TV coverage and devoid of tightly monitored player availabilities, we concentrated on game stories and bringing the personalities to life. Beyond that, minus 24/7 social media. Once our deadlines were met, there was nothing we could do until the next day, so that allowed us time for those awesome pleasures of being on the road. We watched tons of movies: Fiddler on the Roof, My Fair Lady, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, The Godfather, Slapshot. We voraciously scoured book and record stores. Frank had a passion for all sorts of music, including country hurtin' songs. He loved to tell me about "Drop Kick Me Jesus" through the goalposts of life. "I'm just a bug on the windshield of life." "She got the gold mine, I got the shaft." And he was a whiz at music lyrics, belting everything out from Johnny Cash's Folsom Prison Blues to Broadway show tunes. And oh, the restaurants, or our Belgian Congo, as he called it. Dinner at Adolph's Asti Ristorante in Greenwich Village, where the waiters were often pro-opera singers who would burst out singing opera tunes. Manhattan and Dangerfields, where Rodney called Frank, me, and another of our guests the 3 wise men, after Frank answered Rodney's comment, "My wife's so ugly that..." How ugly was she? That was Frank. Tony's in St. Louis, where Frank and I couldn't get over the private tour of their cavernous wine cellar. The Riverboat Restaurant in St. Louis, where Frank said he became squeamish eating his lobster thermidor, while Bill Hewitt talked at length about the great movie he'd just seen called Jaws. Pigtails at the Charcoal Steakhouse in Kitchener. Chasen's in LA, where our trips in pursuit of seeing movie stars always proved fruitless. One night driving to Chasen's, we actually saw a single-engine plane after its perfect emergency landing on the freeway, with Frank providing a play-by-play a la the Superman opening. I see lights. I see wings. It's a plane! Thanks, Frank. I'm just trying to drive through this mess. Then there was Charlie's Cafe Exceptional in Minneapolis. One night we finally got notorious room service diner Roger Nielsen away from his dissection of game film. We wanted Captain Video to pick something special from Charlie's extensive menu, but Roger interrupted Frank's reading of our dinner recommendations saying, "Don't waste your time, guys. Just order me a steak and potatoes." Charlie's was also involved in another highlight. Weather delays meant the flight with us and the Leafs arrived later than expected one night, so we called Charlie's to ask if we still had time to be served. "Get here by 9:30 and we'll do it." We rushed to the hotel lobby where Frank ordered a cab for Orr. Seconds later, Jim McKenney sneaked into the lobby, constantly peering over his shoulder. He said Red Kelly had imposed a strict curfew, but he had promised to meet Dave Keon, who was playing with the Minnesota Fighting Saints in St. Paul. Were we going this way? No, opposite direction. So Jim put in his own call for a cab in the name of McKenney. Within seconds, a cab wheeled up with Jim literally darting to it. He opened the door and said, or McKenney. The cab driver said, or, whereby the Myth McKenney said, "That's what the fucking Bruins said, and look where it got them." Frank had a very unique habit of saying things and being able to get away with it because, well, how can you not like that big, lovable guy? Cases in point. Getting from Toronto to Hartford was always a chore, but we learned there was an airline that had a direct, no deplaning route, albeit with multiple quick stops in New York State. When we arrived at Pearson and went to that airline's check-in counter, we were greeted by two guys in uniform. When we got to the departure lounge, same two guys were there to check our boarding passes. Then one got on the loudspeaker to tell us to head down the stairs to board the plane. The other was at the bottom of the stairs opening the door to the tarmac. They then walked with us with one of them lifting the nose cone and putting the bags in the plane's baggage bin. Before both got into the plane and took their pilot positions in the completely open cockpit. It was a small passenger plane. As we were about to take off, Frank bellowed, "This is the only airline where instead of flight insurance, they give you odds." Everyone laughed, including the two pilots, setting the tone for what became a joke-filled joy flight led by Frank. Another time, at Bloomington Airport in Minnesota, the security lines were much longer because of tighter restrictions following the USA's failed Iran hostage rescue. It was so rigid that the mother of an infant that could barely stand up was told her wailing baby couldn't be carried, but had to walk unattended through the metal detector. That's when Frank piped up, "They've got to check for nitro in the baby's diapers." That broke the tension, but once Frank got to the front of the line, the guard in charge called an associate and ordered him to take Frank into a room for a full body check. So off they went. When Frank returned, accompanied by the sheepish security guard, he said, "It really wasn't that bad, except the guy had cold hands." Once again, mirth in the departure area. During the Sabres' great playoff runs in the 1970s, one night I drove from Toronto to Buffalo with Frank in the front passenger seat, plus Jim Coleman and Milt Dunnell sitting in the back seat. Let's just say we let those legends do the talking. At one point, Jim gleefully talked about his impending divorce, where he and his soon-to-be ex-wife literally divided their house in half with a rope. She stays on her side, I stay on my side, Jim said. It was the story Frank took delight telling time and again, followed by that chuckle of his. Finally, my wedding night in 1977. You know the part where the groom removes the garter from the bride's leg. Well, in a feeble voice, feigning that I needed his help, I said, "Frank!" Spotting him near the stage with that big smile on his face and waving his hand, he said, "You're on your own, kid." Frank, you were respected, loved, and unforgettable. Rest in peace, and thanks for all the wonderful memories. This concludes our memories of Frank. Again, Lisa and Zoe, thank you so much. Jim, it was great to have you here and to meet you. And it's great to see all the friends gathering here again for Frank. There's more food downstairs. The Hockey Hall of Fame is open for your enjoyment. Enjoy the rest of the evening for a great person. Thank you.